The moment I walked into my supervising principal's office and saw the man from the parking lot standing by the window, not in the rain-soaked flannel jacket and muddy work boots I remembered, but in a pressed charcoal blazer with a district lanyard around his neck, I forgot how to close the door behind me. I stood there with my hand still on the handle. He looked at me the same way he had 3 weeks earlier, steady and unhurried, like he had already made up his mind about something and was waiting to see if I'd confirm it. My principal, a woman named Dr. Osei, looked up from her desk. "Come sit down, Lily," she said, "and close that." I did both, but my legs took a second to remember they were mine. Let me back up. I was 14 months into my first real teaching job at Sycamore Creek Elementary in Dayton, Ohio, which meant I had mastered exactly 2 things: making a classroom of 22 third graders sit still for 11 minutes at a time, and smiling through a level of exhaustion I hadn't known was possible before August. Third grade is its own kind of boot camp. The kids are old enough to have opinions and young enough to cry about them freely, and on any given Tuesday, I was equal parts reading teacher, conflict mediator, and the person responsible for making sure nobody ate a crayon. The school itself was fine, good even, by most measures. Decent resources, involved parents, a building that didn't leak. But there was a culture problem, the kind that doesn't show up in any inspection report, that had been there long enough that most of the staff had stopped noticing it. Her name was Miss Kettridge. She'd been the 3rd and 4th grade instructional coach for 9 years, and in that time she'd developed a very specific method of feedback that she delivered quietly, always quietly, in the particular tone of someone who wants the words to land rather than echo. She would sit in the back of your classroom with a clipboard, watch you teach for 30 minutes, and then schedule a debrief that you'd spend the next 3 days dreading. In October, she sat in on my reading lesson. I had worked on it for 2 weeks. I had read 3 books about guided reading strategy. I had asked my college roommate, who had been teaching for 4 years in Columbus, to look over my lesson plan, and she had said it looked solid. Miss Kettridge's debrief lasted 22 minutes. She spent the first 10 telling me that my anchor chart was cluttered, my transition signals were inconsistent, and that I'd let a student named Marcus redirect the discussion in a way that showed a fundamental misunderstanding of who holds the room. She said it while looking at her clipboard rather than at me, which was somehow worse than if she'd made eye contact. I drove home and rewrote my lesson plan. Then I looked at the original one and thought it was fine. Then I lay awake until 1 in the morning wondering if she was right about all of it. That was mid-October. By November, I had developed the habit of arriving at school by 6:45 so I could have the classroom exactly right before anyone walked through it. The morning everything shifted started like every other one that month. It was a Wednesday, the first week of December, and it had been raining since the night before in that gray, determined Ohio way that makes everything feel slightly heavier than it should. The school parking lot had a low spot near the rear entrance that always flooded when it rained, and by the time I pulled in, there was a good 6 inches of standing water blocking the path to the door. I had learned to keep rubber boots in my car by mid-September. I pulled them on in the driver's seat, grabbed my bag and my coffee thermos, and started making my way across the lot. There was a man near the side entrance struggling with a cardboard box that had gotten wet on the bottom and was starting to give. He was older, maybe late 60s or early 70s, in a jacket that wasn't quite right for the weather, the kind of thing you'd wear in October but not December, and he was trying to get a grip on the box while holding an umbrella that the wind kept turning inside out. The box went first. The bottom gave and about half of what was in it. Folders, what looked like a planner, a thermos, a paperback. Hit the puddle. I was already moving before I'd decided to. I set my bag down on a dry patch of pavement, handed him my umbrella, and started collecting the things that had landed in the water. The folders were soaked. I did my best to shake them off. The paperback was a lost cause. His planner had landed face down and the cover was warped, but the inside pages seemed okay. "I've got it," I said. "Don't worry about the umbrella, I have a hood." He looked at me the way people do when they're trying to figure out if someone is helping them or performing helpfulness, because those are different things and most people can tell. "You don't have to do that," he said. His voice was low and even. the kind of voice that belongs to someone who spent a lot of time being listened to in rooms where listening mattered. "It's already done," I said, and handed him the stack of things I'd collected. The folders were still dripping. He looked down at them, then at me. "Thank you," he said. Not reflexively. Deliberately. Like he meant the specific thing that had just happened, not just the concept of it. I grabbed my bag, handed him back his things in a more manageable arrangement, and went inside to set up for the day. I didn't think about it again. Not really. I was 7 minutes behind schedule, and I still needed to rearrange the reading groups before the first bell, and I had a parent email sitting in my inbox that I'd been composing a response to in my head since the night before. The rest of that Wednesday was the kind of day that grinds you down in small increments. 2 of my students had a falling out at recess that bled back into the afternoon. My small group lesson ran long, and I didn't get to the writing block I'd planned. And at 2:45, I got a note in my mailbox that Ms. Kettridge wanted to schedule a follow-up observation for the following week, attached to a list of focus areas that made it clear she'd already decided what she expected to find. I stood in the hallway reading that note for probably 45 seconds. My colleague from across the hall found me there. She was a 4th-grade teacher who had been at Sycamore Creek for 6 years, and she had developed a kind of philosophical endurance about Miss Kettridge that I was still working toward. She looked at the note and said, "Focus areas." "Focus areas," I said. She made a face that communicated everything that needed to be communicated and said, "Come eat lunch with me tomorrow. I'll tell you about the time she gave me a write-up for the font on my word wall." I appreciated that. I did not feel better, but I appreciated it. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that felt less like growth and more like bracing. I planned carefully. I documented everything. I started writing down the specific feedback Ms. Kettridge gave me after each interaction so I could track it, because I'd noticed that what she flagged in October contradicted what she praised in September, and I wanted to have a record in case I needed it. My colleague across the halls said that was smart. She said it in a way that suggested she wished she'd done the same thing earlier. There was one afternoon in mid-November when I stayed until nearly 6, trying to rework a writing unit that Ms. Kettridge had described as missing the thread. I went back to the original version I'd submitted in September and read it again. The thread was there. It had been there the whole time. I was almost certain of it. I updated 3 sections anyway because I didn't trust myself enough yet to be certain about anything. About 2.5 weeks after the morning in the parking lot, I was walking to my car after school on a Friday when I saw the man again. He was near the main entrance talking to the district's assistant superintendent, a woman I'd met once at an orientation and recognized mostly by her very distinctive red coat. They were standing close together and speaking in the way people do when the conversation is serious and not meant to be overheard. The man had his hands in his jacket pockets and was nodding slowly as she talked. He saw me before I decided whether to acknowledge him. He gave me a short nod, the same one he'd given me in the parking lot, unhurried, like he had exactly the time for it, and I nodded back and kept walking. I thought about it off and on through the weekend, not obsessively, just the way you think about something that doesn't quite fit where you've put it. On Monday morning, Dr. Osei's assistant stopped me in the hallway before first bell and said the principal wanted to see me at 7:15. Dr. Osei had been principal at Sycamore Creek for 8 years. She was the kind of leader who made decisions slowly and stuck to them, who had strong opinions about reading instruction and recess, and who, in my experience, called teachers in before school for exactly 2 categories of reasons, something good or something serious. There was rarely a middle. I knocked at 7:12 because I was 3 minutes early and couldn't make myself wait in the hallway any longer. "Come in," she said. I opened the door and saw him. He was standing near the window instead of sitting, which I wasn't expecting, and he was wearing a blazer and the district lanyard, and it took me a full 3 seconds to connect him to the man in the rain with the wet folders and the inside-out umbrella. I stopped walking. My hand was still on the door. "Come sit down, Lily," Dr. Osei said, and closed that. I did, and I sat, and the room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms get quiet when everyone already knows what's about to happen, except one person. The man sat down across from me. "I believe we've met," he said, "though under wetter circumstances." His name was Mr. Calloway, not the first name I would have guessed. He had spent 28 years in public education, classroom, then curriculum director, then a deputy superintendent role in 2 different districts in the Midwest. For the past 3 years, he had been working as an independent evaluator for the State Board of Education, brought in to assess school culture, instructional leadership pipelines, and what he called the distance between what a school says it values and what actually happens in the building. He had been at Sycamore Creek for 5 weeks. He had not introduced himself when he arrived, by design. He had visited classrooms during open observation windows. He had eaten in the staff lounge. He had, apparently, sat in the parking lot in the rain with a wet cardboard box. I processed this in pieces. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. And he had a way of saying things that made it clear the words had been chosen rather than reached for. "I've spent 5 weeks in this building, and I've watched a lot of interactions, the way staff talk to each other in the hallways, the way feedback gets given and received, the way people move when they think no one is watching." He paused, and I watched what happened in the parking lot. I thought about the wet folders, the inside-out umbrella, the paperback I hadn't been able to save. "I wasn't trying to do anything," I said, because it felt like it needed to be said. The box was falling apart. It was raining." "I know," he said. "That's exactly what I mean." He picked up a folder from the corner of Dr. Osei's desk. I hadn't noticed it there, and opened it. I recognized the format. It was a program review document, dense with observation notes, a few sections highlighted in yellow. "I also watched coaching interactions," he said, and his tone shifted slightly, not harder but more deliberate, "over several weeks across multiple staff members." He closed the folder again without showing me what was inside. "There is a version of instructional coaching that builds teachers," he said. "It identifies patterns, offers specific and actionable feedback, and treats the person on the receiving end as a capable professional who is learning. And there is a version that creates compliance through discomfort. Those are not the same thing, and the outcomes they produce are very different, for teachers and for students." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what there was to say that wouldn't come out wrong. "In October," he said, "you submitted a reading lesson that was flagged in a debrief as unfocused and structurally weak." He looked at me steadily. I pulled the original plan. My stomach shifted. "It was neither of those things," he said. "It was a well-structured, age-appropriate lesson with a clear objective and a reasonable approach to differentiation. What it was slightly different from a preferred format." The room was very quiet. I had rewritten that lesson. I had lain awake over that lesson. I had looked at the original 3 times and second-guessed what I was seeing in my own work. "I want to be clear," Mr. Calloway said. "I'm not here to litigate a grievance. That's not what this meeting is. Dr. Osei and I have been discussing several structural questions about this school's coaching model, and those conversations are ongoing. But I wanted to speak with you directly." He leaned forward slightly. "I watched how you responded to the environment you were in. You didn't cut corners. You didn't pull back. You came in earlier. You kept records. You followed up on your own students on your own time. You stayed in the work even when the work was telling you that you weren't good enough for it." He paused. "You didn't shrink," he said, and that told me something. I realized I was holding my coffee cup with both hands and gripping it harder than was necessary. "The parking lot," I said. "You were testing something." He looked at me for a moment. "I dropped a box in the rain," he said. "What people do next, that's not a test. That's just information." Something about the way he said it made me think he'd had to explain the difference before, more than once. Dr. Osei spoke for the first time since I'd sat down. "We're not asking you to do anything today. Mr. Calloway wanted to meet personally with a few staff members as part of his assessment. You're one of 3 he asked to speak with." I nodded. "I do want to say one more thing," Mr. Calloway said. "What you've been experiencing this year is not the standard we hold in this district, or the standard this school is going to hold going forward. Decisions have been made about the coaching structure here. Those changes will be communicated to staff through the appropriate channels, but they are coming, and they are substantive." He paused again. "You didn't cause them. But you should know they're happening, and you should know that the kind of teaching I observed in your classroom across 4 separate visits is exactly what we are trying to protect and grow. Not manage, not correct. Grow." I walked out of Dr. Assey's office at 7:31. I had 9 minutes before first bell. I went to my classroom, put down my bag, turned on the lights, and stood there for a moment, just looking at the anchor charts on the walls and the reading corner I'd rebuilt twice, because the first arrangement didn't feel right. Then I went and checked that the morning meeting materials were set out and pulled up my attendance sheet, because that's what there was to do. My colleague from across the hall found me at lunch, same as most Fridays. I told her about the meeting in the order it had happened, which was the only way I could tell it because my brain was still processing the sequence. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, and when I finished, she said, "The box." "The box," I said. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "You know what the worst part is?" I walked past him. I saw the box, I was on my phone, and I just walked past. I didn't say anything. "I would have helped," she said. "I think I would have. I'd like to think that. But I was already running late, and I'd just gotten a text from a parent, and I just walked past." I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, about what had been different that morning. And I still don't know that there was something. I'd been running late too. I had my own list of things to manage, but the box went and the bottom gave, and it was raining, and whatever calculation my brain usually runs to produce a reason for not stopping, that morning it didn't finish running. Maybe that's all that decency ever is sometimes, not being a better person than you were yesterday, just being too busy to talk yourself out of it. The rest of December was different. Not dramatically, but in ways I noticed. Miss Kettridge ran the January observation the same way she always had. Clipboard, quiet voice, the careful selection of what to land on. But I stood in the debrief and answered her questions and looked at my own lesson plan and thought about what Mr. Calloway had said about the distance between what a school says it values and what it actually rewards, and I thought about the October lesson that had been flagged for being different rather than wrong. When she told me that my small group rotations were still lacking intentionality, I said I'd like to understand specifically what intentionality would look like in that context, so I can align my planning with that expectation. I said it politely. I wrote down what she said next. I thanked her and left. It felt different from every other debrief I'd sat through. Not easier, just different. Like I was in the room doing a job, rather than in the room being assessed for whether I was allowed to keep doing it. In February, Dr. Osei sent a staff-wide email about changes to the instructional support model, effective at the start of the spring semester. It was written in the careful language that institutional communications always use, but the meaning was clear to anyone who had been paying attention. A new coaching framework, a third-party review of current practices, a restructured feedback process with a peer observation component. My colleague forwarded it with just a single line. "Did you read this?" I had. Mr. Calloway's name appeared in the acknowledgments section at the bottom, under with support from district evaluation consultants. By March, we had a new instructional coach. Her name was Ms. Whitman, and she had spent 12 years in the classroom before moving into curriculum work, and she ran our first group session like a conversation about teaching rather than a review of whether we were doing it correctly. She asked what was working. She asked what felt impossible. She wrote things down and came back the following week and said, "I thought about what you said about the reading block, and I want to try something." It sounds small. It wasn't small. I still kept the records I'd started keeping in October, the notes, the documentation, the running log of feedback and responses. Not because I needed it the same way, but the habit had settled into something useful. Writing things down, tracking what I'd tried and what it had produced, asking the question before I assumed I already knew the answer. Those were good instincts, it turned out. regardless of the circumstances that had built them. In April, a first-year teacher started at our school, mid-year replacement for a second-grade position that had been vacant since January. She was 23, and her name was Audrey, and I found her standing in her empty classroom on her second day, looking at the walls the way you look at something when you don't know where to start. I knocked on the doorframe. "I'm Lily," I said. "I teach third grade down the hall." I know this room looked better when the other teacher was here, but she had 4 years and a very specific taste in border tape. Audrey laughed, surprised, the kind of laugh that happens when you've been braced for something serious and got something human instead. I showed her where the laminator was. I showed her the shortcut to the copy room that saves 3 minutes. Which matters more than it sounds when you have 20 students and a planning period that somehow always runs short. I told her about the parking lot flooding when it rains and to keep something waterproof in her car. I told her that the October slump is real and it ends, and that if she ever needed to borrow a read-aloud book because she'd run out of ideas on a Wednesday afternoon, my classroom library had no checkout system and no judgment. She came by twice that week, once for a book, and once just to say she was glad I'd knocked. Small things, but they accumulate, I think, the way all small things do, in one direction or another, without asking permission, without announcing themselves. I finished my first full year at Sycamore Creek in June. No particular ceremony to it. The last day of school ends the way all school days end, too fast, with too much to carry out, and not enough boxes for it. The kids left. The hallways went quiet. I put the last of my classroom into my car in 2 trips, and drove home in the early afternoon sun. Somewhere in the second half of May, I had run into Mr. Calloway again. Not at school, but at the coffee shop, 2 blocks from the district office. He was at a corner table with what looked like a stack of reports and a very large black coffee. He looked up and recognized me. "Miss Garrison," he said. It was the first time anyone in any professional context had called me that, without it feeling like a question about whether I belonged there. I got my order and raised it once in his direction. He nodded the same way he always had. Steady and unhurried, like he had exactly the time for it. I thought, driving home on the last day of school, about what he'd said in Dr. O'Sea's office. That I hadn't shrunk. I wasn't entirely sure that was true, or that it was the whole story. I think there were mornings in November when I had gotten smaller, in the slow way that happens when you're told often enough that what you made isn't good enough. I think the records I kept were partly a record of that, a ledger of everything I was afraid of getting wrong. But I also thought about Audrey, in her empty classroom on her second day looking at the walls, and about my colleague across the hall who had said I would have helped. I think in a way that meant she wasn't sure, and about the morning in December when I hadn't been sure either, and then the box had gone and there wasn't time to be unsure anymore. You find out what you're made of in those moments, I think, not in the big tests, but in the small, unscheduled ones. Not because you're watching for the information, but because the situation asks and something in you answers before you've had a chance to prepare an answer. I wasn't prepared that morning. I was tired and behind schedule, and not in any mood to stand in the rain collecting wet folders for a stranger. Turns out that was exactly the right mood for it. I thought a lot about what actually happened that December morning, and the more I turn it over, the less it looks like luck. Mr. Calloway didn't change the direction of my career because I helped him pick up wet folders. He changed it because of what he'd already seen in the weeks before that, the careful documentation, the early mornings, the lesson I'd rewritten and then reread and quietly decided was right the first time. The parking lot was the last piece of information, not the first. What it confirmed was something that had been building for months, without anyone outside that building knowing it was there. That's how I've come to understand cause and effect in my own life. Not as a ledger where one good act earns one good outcome, but as something slower and more honest. The things you do when you're tired and no one is keeping score. Those accumulate. They become the record of who you actually are, as opposed to who you are when you know someone's watching. I was not a good person that morning because I helped a stranger in the rain. I was just a person who didn't stop to construct a reason not to. The box fell, the rain was coming down, and the calculation that usually produces a polite excuse didn't finish running. What I did wasn't virtue. It was just the absence of a good argument against it. But here's what I've learned matters more than the moment itself, what I did before it and after it. Before, I stayed in the work even when the work told me I wasn't measuring up. I kept records when the feedback didn't add up. I went back to my original lesson plan a third time, because something in me hadn't given up on the reasoning behind it. That's not stubbornness. That's what it looks like when you trust your own thinking enough to keep developing it under pressure instead of abandoning it. After I knocked on Audrey's door, I showed her the laminator and the copy room shortcut and told her the October slump ends. I did it because I remembered what it felt like when the building was big and unfamiliar and the feedback was coming at me from all directions and nobody had offered to just walk me to the elevator. Knowing something from the inside makes you responsible for passing it on. That's not a rule I read anywhere. It's just what I noticed to be true. Miss Kettridge taught me something she didn't intend to. She taught me the difference between feedback that builds a person and feedback that merely produces compliance. I was complying for a while, coming in earlier, rewriting things that didn't need rewriting, doubting what I thought was clear. It took Mr. Calloway reading my original lesson plan and saying this was fine, actually for me to understand that I had known it was fine, and that knowing it and staying in the work anyway was its own form of intelligence, one that doesn't show up in a debrief but shows up everywhere else. You find out what you're made of, not in the moments of obvious courage, but in the ordinary Tuesday of it. The wet parking lot before first bell, the note reread at midnight, the new teacher standing alone in an empty classroom who doesn't need advice so much as she needs someone to act like she belongs there. Those are the moments that add up. They always do. And they add up whether or not anyone is watching, which is exactly the point.